Hi, everyone, and welcome and thank you for joining us for our fourth annual Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice in Environmental Data Science speaker series. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Keara Lightning, our second speaker in this seminar series. I am Justin Cotti, a data coordinator at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. I am joined by the rest of the DEIJ Seminar Series Planning Committee, Amelia, Christina, Juliet, Erica, Mona, and Angie. At NCEAS, we work to accelerate scientific discoveries that enhance our understanding of the world and benefit people and nature, as well as to transform the scientific culture to be more open, efficient, and collaborative. For more information, check out the NCEAS website. Before we begin, we ask you to join us in acknowledging the Chumash peoples, who are the environmental stewards of the land on which NCEAS is located. We pay our respects to the Chumash peoples and their elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. We acknowledge that this land on which we live and work are the traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples, including the Chumash peoples. This land today is the result of the erasures and exclusions of Indigenous peoples. As we come together to bring awareness to the issues of equity and justice, we recognize that the Chumash people and so many other Indigenous people are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. As we continue to work towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in data science, we strive to prioritize Indigenous data sovereignty and self-determination. Now, I will introduce you to our speaker for today and give you some logistical information about this presentation. I'm delighted to welcome Keara Lightning to our DEIJ seminar series. For all of you joining us for this webinar, please feel free to add questions you may have at any time during the talk through the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We will have a moderated Q&A section including these questions at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Keara Lightning is a PhD student in wildlife ecology in the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta. She is from Samson Cree Nation. Keara's master's thesis, titled The Ecology of Possession, critically examined environmental management as a site of knowledge production that is shaped by colonial narratives of land and property. Her PhD research focuses on collaborating with Indigenous communities to revitalize cultural burning practices and addresses wildfire management. Keara, we are very excited to have you. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me here. Guess I'll just get started. Danse Asapiesis Atsigason Muscochise Cotinia. My name is Keara Lightning, as you heard, and I'm from Samson Cree Nation, as you heard. I won't introduce myself too much since you already heard my bio, but I'm a PhD student at the University of Alberta, and I'm going to be talking a bit about the research that I did for my master's thesis, which was in Native Studies, but bridged my way into the work I'm doing in the resources department. I have just a little outline of some of the things I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to talk a bit about the context of my work, the lab that I work with at the U of A, which is the Indigenous Science, Technology, and Society Lab, a bit about applying the work from Indigenous STS to ecology and understanding Indigenous and human agency in the environment, specifically what fire regimes teach us about human agency in the environment, and the case study that I did for my master's research looking at the ecology of the Beaver Hills. And then, some conclusions. So at the University of Alberta, I work with the Indigenous Science, Technology, and Society Lab, which is easier to refer to as Indigenous STS. This little card here on the left, the Indigenous Peoples and Technoscience, that's a course, a big online course that we have at the university that I help to support the development of by Dr. Kim Tallbear and Dr. Jessica Kolopenik, who are the PIs for our lab. I'm currently teaching it right now for the spring semester. And I have a quote here from Jessica Kolopenic that says, that really summarizes a lot of the work that we do in Indigenous STS, where she said, modern knowledge production that has been formative of scientific fields has reiterated Indigenous peoples as not being reasoned enough to produce valid knowledge to run real governments or to own land. So a large part of what we do in Indigenous STS is work collaboratively and critically with scientific fields to make them more supportive of Indigenous-led research and Indigenous governance of scientific knowledge and resources. And an example of that is the summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, where you can see me characteristically yawning in that picture there of some of the work that we did. I was one of the interns last year. And on the right, there is a photo from our DNA lab that we set up in a teepee on a cultural site in the Edmonton area, where we were doing soil testing. And one of the really great things about the lab that we have there is that the Faculty of Native Studies in the years previous to this had to borrow equipment and lab space from the science departments at the university. And as a part of our understanding of governance and leadership, they actually established our own lab there in the Faculty of Native Studies, which is a really unique thing. So rather than just having to rely on getting outside help for these things, we are leading, being leaders in leading our own research and having our own resources and being able to run it ourselves. This is, let's see. Oh, so this is about taking seriously the role of science in governance today and in the importance of our communities to take a role to understand the impact of science on Indigenous peoples and aspects like how science impacts the way people understand Indigenous identity, the way it impacts governance, and the way it impacts our access to resources and infrastructure and Indigenous rights in governance and in the law. And part of this is how Dr. Kim Tallbear, I think especially, has led talking about Indigenous knowledge, the way it's understood, that we, or she defines it a little bit differently, shifts that definition from just being about knowledge that is passed down to saying that Indigenous knowledge in a more future-oriented way is about whatever knowledge helps us to survive and to thrive and survive as Indigenous people and survive with Indigenous livelihoods. And that really opens up our definition to be able to engage with different knowledges and to create new knowledge. And that was really helpful for me as someone who did, as I'll go into, did my undergrad in environmental science. I took an undergrad in Indigenous environmental science at Trent University in Ontario. And so for many years, I've worked in environmental education, working with youth and working with training environmental educators to include Indigenous stories. I worked in agriculture and landscaping, native plant gardens, and more recently also, as I moved to Alberta, working in more community research, engaging with revitalizing ceremony and doing community work with people in Edmonton. But part of this, I might actually skip ahead a slide. Part of the difficulty that I had with this was that the framework that we were given in these fields to understand the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and science was largely governed by this framework of knowledge integration. So people most often talk about how can we integrate Indigenous knowledge and science? And it's this narrative that really separates science and Indigenous knowledge into these separate things that we can then integrate together. And in Indigenous STS, as you might see in that quote I had up earlier, we talk more about how these knowledge systems have been intertwined and impacted and co-produced through colonial history. So science has always been impacted by defining itself against other knowledges. And so those things have been impacting each other all along and don't necessarily have to now be integrated, but we can think more consciously about the ways that they impact each other and be more conscious of that. And the problem that I had with this, the way that it felt insufficient, I guess, is the way that it failed to address power dynamics and resources and governance. That the way these knowledge integration, say, braiding sweetgrass is the most famous one, book by Robin Kimmerer. They're useful in a lot of ways, but they also paint Indigenous knowledge as a sort of individual or spiritual relationship to the environment or to plants or animals, rather than understanding the larger structural context and governance structures that these knowledges are a part of. And we'll get a bit more into that. But I wanted to also add in, I usually start a lot of my writing and talks with quotes from my great uncle or my mushroom or chapan and other relatives. So this is a quote from my my grandmother's uncle, Albert Lightning, an interview profile that was done on him where they say that Albert talked a lot about natural law. He said that humans' inner natures are an exact copy of the nature of the universe, and deep knowledge of the self comes from nature. So I've looked at this and other understandings as a way to ground myself working in environmental science and how to understand that differently. And part of what I take away from this, I don't want to go too deeply into natural law because it's a really complex cultural topic. But part of what I take away from this here is how the understanding of how nature and humans are related and co-produced on a really fundamental level, not only a spiritual level, but on a real material, physical level, humans and nature are not separate. We shape each other, reflect each other. We are shaped by our environment, and we also shape our environment through our actions. And I continue this with also acknowledging my kukum, my grandmother, Elizabeth Lightning, who did a master's and PhD later in life, like when I was born. And so as I was writing my master's thesis, I really took a lot of inspiration by looking back at the writing that she did, and through having a lot of talks with her about these topics, because as you can see in this quote, which I'll read in a second, she has grappled a lot with this idea of the difference between worldviews and native worldviews and scientific worldviews. And I just had a long talk with her about it last night. It's something she thinks about a lot, and she often gets troubled by the fact that I'm teaching and talking about science so much, because this dichotomy has always concerned her. So in her, I think this is in her PhD thesis, I'm not sure. But the quote says, "The dichotomy between the scientific worldview and the holistic worldview is a problem for all people, whether they're native or non-native. The issue is that it may not ever be resolved, but agency is to be able to have dreams and visions and to have I can't see my slide, to have the means to carry them out. And native people have been prevented from exercising this type of agency." So I want to center that idea of agency, and that's going to come up a lot throughout this talk. See, and where I started to get a different framework for understanding Indigenous knowledge and the environment and science is through a lot of the work of Potawatomi scholar Cal White. And in this article, I have a quote from here. He talks about, he and co-authors talk about using the word ecology to, quote, denote human agency in ecosystems, whether that agency is the Indigenous knowledge of seasonal rounds that shape the lands and waters of Menominee ancestral territories, or the settler desires to shape the same lands and waters to reflect and support their aspirations. And what I understand from this, and I have some photos there just to give a visual of this, is that the different societies shape their environments by and to suit their economies and livelihoods, governance systems and structures. So, for example, a settler ecology/economy requires these infrastructures of roads. That's a part of the way the society is structured, and that changes the physical environment around us. And that ecology is not, it's not commensurable or compatible with a bison economy, with Plains Indigenous economies, which are based around the bison. So even when we're working on bison restoration today, we have to work within the settler ecology. We can't restore them to their rightful place on the prairies because the lands that we're trying to restore them to are covered in roads and they can't do their migrations and their seasonal rounds. So the as we'll go into next, colonialism is very bound up with ecology in a way that I don't think is often talked about explicitly. So this other quote here from Coway and co-authors says, settler colonialism is a form of oppression in which settlers permanently and ecologically inscribe homelands of their own onto Indigenous homelands. So in establishing a settler colonial society, Indigenous ecologies, Indigenous lands and homelands have to be made both physically and socially or narratively into settler homelands. And that changes the landscape in a very material and physical way in order to be able to support that narrative where in order to understand the land as being open to settlement, the land has to be cleared for settlement. And then that changes the way that we understand the past of that environment, because when you change the landscape, it actually changes all of those histories and stories that are present on the landscape, the way that you can understand seeing certain like landscape features and environments and like things like trap lines where people have their family histories bound up in their trap lines. When those areas are cleared, those stories are no longer physically present on the landscape, and that is like our archive. Should I take a drink? So another example I often give in classes when I talk about this is the Mountain Legacy Project has done some awesome repeat photography work where they've taken archival photos of places and then they go to find those specific places on the landscape and take a modern picture so that you can see like as close as possible to an actual what it looked like then, what it looks like now. And in a lot of those pictures, there's a lot of them, so I just picked one. You can see that in the past and often like the late 1800s to like the first years of the 1900s, most of these photos are from, the landscape often looks more open and more cleared than it does today. And I think that is contrary to what most people think about when they would think about what's the change in the land between pre-colonial to colonial times. People would often think more that it would be more developed than it was in the past now. But often these pictures are showing a place that was lived in and developed, and today is more overgrown than it was. And I would characterize this like similarly to, I can't think of the right word, but like economic polarization or economic stratification, where the rich get really rich and the poor get really poor in an environmental sense. There's an environmental polarization where places that are set aside as wilderness and there's places that are developed. And so, whereas in the past, most of this land was being lived on and almost more equal, I guess. Now what you see is that land is either overgrown and wilderness natural, or it's developed. And that's the way that nature is understood. And I'll get a bit more into that. But a big part of this past where the land looked more open has to do with fire. And obviously that's a hot topic right now. I don't mean to jump in, it's not on purpose. Where they some researchers have used those photos from the Mountain Legacy Project to look at how you can identify fire regimes in those photos, where you can see that there's a difference between a place that is just a natural opening in the landscape, or to see that we can have a pretty solid idea that some of these places were places where people were maintaining them with burning practices, because there's not a lot of open litter and fuels on the ground that there would be if these were just places that were naturally falling over and dying over on their own. But that they are actually completely open and clear, and that's because that was Native people who were maintaining these areas. So they can be sometimes thought of as, like I like to refer to it as being developed in a way, because they were being actively maintained, taken care of on a seasonal basis. And I just took this summary slide from a class that I taught because I realized maybe some people wouldn't be familiar with controlled or cultural burning, maybe. So these photos and information here is taken from a film called Fires of Spring, which you can find on YouTube if you want. It's really, really cool. And that was footage taken from the work of Professor Henry Lewis, who is doing research at the University of Alberta with Northern Alberta Indigenous communities on their practices of controlled burning in, I think this is in the 80s. And has a really long, really cool report on that research. And there's a bunch of interviews in this film with people there who talk about the practices that they still have in their living memory, these elders in the 80s, and also the changes in the landscape that they've seen in their lifetime, in their parents' lifetime, where these places that are in northern Alberta, they're characterized as boreal forests, and that they talk about as now being these I would call overgrown boreal forests, often have names like high prairie, like things that refer to prairies and plains, even though they're northern boreal forests. And they talk about that as being because these were prairies and plains, that these places that they look over and it's all forest, that in their own living memory, this place used to be open. You could see far in the horizon, it was all open. And that's because it was maintained with burning. And they talk about the change in access to resources because of the lack of burning, where places where berries used to grow don't grow anymore, that their trap lines are overgrown, so the hunting areas are not being maintained. It's not good for the animals as well. That it's a lot harder to access the trap lines, to access plants and resources on the land, because it is not being maintained as it was for hundreds of years. Oh, I think there's supposed to be a video in here, but I don't know if it's going to work. Oh, it does work. Okay. So as I've mentioned, I work at the University of Alberta, and my family's from this area in Musqueam. And we call Edmonton Musqueam, which means Beaver Hills House, and that refers to Fort Edmonton. And comes from Amiskwaci, the Beaver Hills, and that's the area that is around us here, what it's called. And to the east, just east of the city, they have what's called the Beaver Hills Biosphere, and that's where Elk Island National Park is, and a bunch of other nature reserves. And so for my master's thesis, partly shaped by the fact that I was doing this research during the pandemic, I chose a way to do this research that would be not require, not being able to meet with people and do things in contact with people or go anywhere. I chose a research that would be very document based. So what I did was I took all of the environmental management plans that I could get throughout the history of the national park and analyzed how they build narratives about the environment and how they build narratives about Indigenous landscapes and the presence or non-presence and agency and non-agency of Indigenous people in those landscapes. So this is a case study in those narratives that I've been talking about. This video thing doesn't work very well. Okay. This quote is mostly just to set the scene to understand the Beaver Hills. So the Beaver Hills, I'll read the quote here, this is from a major in 1871 who was traveling to Fort Edmonton. And he said, as we journeyed on towards Edmonton, the country maintained its rich and beautiful appearance. Everywhere nature had written in unmistakable characters the story of the fertility over which we rode. Everywhere the eye looked upon panoramas filled with the beauty of lake and winding river, and grassy slope and undulating woodland. The whole face of the country was indeed one vast park. And I included this because the way that the Beaver Hills is often described has to do with its richness and fertility and the amount of resources present in the land. But often when environments are described this way, it's something that is, sorry, often when environments are described this way in these sort of journals and explorers narratives, those are used still to establish, like they're the only records that we often have about what environments and places looked like in the past. So still when you read about a place, either they refer directly to these sort of descriptions or indirectly through like citing sources of sources. And so these narratives still understand how we talk about, study, and understand environments today. And these narratives, like you can see when he says nature here, this is understood as purely natural richness and natural fertility, and not understood to be related to the people who lived there, the way that you might describe like agricultural fields, their richness of fertility. Well, these lands are understood as being just naturally rich and not as a part of the result of the way that people lived and managed that land through their livelihoods and stewardship. And that denial of Indigenous presence is so seeped into our consciousness through these narratives, and it impacts everything about the way we speak and think and manage the environment. And so to look at a few more specific examples from this case study, the Beaver Hills and Elk Island is a really interesting case study in fire and ecology and how it impacts narratives and history, because the way that the park was established is built on the fact that around the time of settlement, they describe huge fires happening that basically reset the landscape. That when people were settling and starting their, what do you call it, homesteads, the easiest way to clear the land was to just burn everything. And so there's these huge fires that are described at that time. And as I say in these quotes, the area, which later became Elk Island National Park, was burned so severely that only a few scattered trees in places sheltered by water, muskeg, or on north slopes of hills escaped. The large game population was destroyed. In fact, the entire area between Edmonton and Beaver Lake, Fort Saskatchewan, and Cooking Lake was dead. And the way my laptop's set up, I can't see this slide, but you can read it. And this is a really interesting case study in those colonial ecologies, because the way that the Indigenous history is then erased on the landscape, and it sets the stage for whatever narratives that we want to put in place about that landscape. And there's no real way to prove otherwise because the physical evidence is gone. And that impacts the way that the landscape is understood throughout the history of Elk Island National Park and still to today, because the way that management works in trying to categorize landscapes into what type of ecology it is. And what really stood out to me and was so fascinating to me about this history was the way that in the management of the park, there is such disagreement and contradiction about how to categorize this landscape, a disagreement over whether it is a boreal forest or a grassland or a parkland. And the way that you understand that is shaped by the way that you understand fire and humans on that landscape. Because if the natural and rightful way for the landscape to be is without any impact, then those managers will classify it as a boreal forest. Because if you, in theory, as they say in this first quote here, the soil, climate, and vegetation of the area without any fire, without any disturbance, would eventually support a climax forest of white spruce. And those narratives, there were certain managers in the history of the park who were really passionate about that, and they read that sort of thing and said, well, people have been saying this is a grassland or a parkland, but obviously it's a boreal forest. So they changed their management practices to manage it as a boreal forest, and that includes planting spruce forests, and that includes suppressing fire, and that actually loops back around to change the physical landscape of the park based on the way that you understand its history and how you classify it. So if you manage it as a boreal forest, then you create a boreal forest. If you manage it as a grassland, you create a grassland. So the way that we classify environments is not a purely scientific understanding, but it's based on our social understandings of the history of the area and the role of humans. So even once people started to acknowledge the importance of fire and stop denying that fire was an important part of the ecology, then people start to referring to it as a parkland area, which is a sort of transition zone between grasslands and boreal. And that transition zone is really mediated by fire that keeps the forest from entering into certain areas. So you get sort of a what do you call it? A mosaic of aspen, boreal, and grass. But even in understanding fire there and really centering it, fire is still talked about as a purely natural force. So then the management plans go into these later management plans talk a lot about fire, but they always talk about fire as we acknowledge now that fire is a natural force in the environment. It's a natural part of the environment. And so nature, again, is this disembodied force that takes the place of understanding what humans lived there. And so still in the narrative of the landscape, it's still understood as basically not having humans there. Even as, you know, humans are acknowledged to have been there, but not to have had an impact on the environment. The Indigenous people are understood as just basically floating along the top of the landscape and not impacting it. And we'll get more into that in a second. But I think it's almost a psychological resistance that creates a lot of contradictions in the way the environment is studied and understood, because the things that are being said about it kind of contradict each other in the amount of lightning strikes. Because when we're saying that fire is a natural force, the only natural force that creates fire is really lightning strikes. And then so you have to prove and account for the amount of lightning strikes that it would need to maintain this area naturally. And most of the time it makes more sense to understand that humans had a big role in shaping that landscape, because human fires have a very different structure and impact than purely lightning fires do. Controlled burns are done in a controlled way, done in a regular what do you call that? A regular like routine or rotation. They're done at a certain intensity, and they're controlled that way. And that creates a different environment than just wildfires. And take a quick detour. That as I was trying to understand this resistance and contradictions that I saw in environmental studies. I came across a Australian Indigenous scholar, Eileen Morton Robinson, and she has a amazing book called The White Possessive. And this quote I have here from it says, quote, "For Indigenous people, white possession is not unmarked, unnamed, or invisible. It is hypervisible. These cities signify with every building and every street that this land is now possessed by others." And I have worked and thought a lot with this aspect and how does it show up in the study of the environment, because her and others have applied it to many other fields, even scientific fields. My supervisors, Doctors Kim Talber and Jessica Kolopenik, they work a lot with genetics and DNA, but I didn't see many people applying this to environmental science, which very directly has to do with resources and ownership and property. But in this quote here, like she's talking about buildings and streets, so she's talking about urban environments. And what I want to also argue is that it's not only built environments and urban environments like cities that signify Indigenous dispossession, as she says. The idea of wilderness and nature is built upon this idea of possession as well, and it signifies possession when we look out over a landscape that is supposed to be natural and wilderness, where you see this beautiful, pristine landscape. We also see the ghosts of the nations who lived there. It's an overgrown landscape that's been abandoned, that's been cleared of the people who lived on that landscape. So it's yeah, it's not only buildings and development that signifies colonial possession, it's also empty landscapes, nature and wilderness, where those were people's homelands, those were people's who shaped that land, who have been removed, and that's an overgrown land that's no longer being cared for by the people who used to care for it. And Morton Robinson describes this possession as shaping a whole ontology in colonialism. And I had to really try to understand what ontology means. And maybe you understand it, but I had to try to understand what that really means. And I basically compare it to like botanical taxonomies are like an ontology, how you understand the categories and relationships between different things. And so colonialism is structured by an ontology of possession, where everything is either something with subjectivity, agency, and the ability to possess, or things are objects or possessions. So everything is either a possessor or a possession. And that shapes everything within colonial psychology and the way that we study in disciplines like the sciences. And as I've been talking about, this underlies assumptions about the way we look at the environment, because the sciences have a real investment in possession of the land, state possession of the land, and to understand Indigenous people as having historical and present agency over their land and resources would imply that at that time they also had rights, intelligence, and possession, and that undermines the present state's legitimacy, its actions, and the assumptions of possession. It underlines assumptions of property. Oops. And some of the ways that I saw this looking through those management plans are in narratives like this. Agriculture has a huge part in this, and this understanding of agriculture is really linked to agency, and whether you are having an impact over the environment is linked to whether you're seen to have a right or possession or property of the environment. And I'll read this quote because I think it's such a rich text. I think this is from one of the, what do you call it, interpretive plans for the park. And they said the European influence brought new elements of change to the Canadian landscape. technology like guns, tools, and metal, and the dictates of another culture's fashions, economics, and politics began to make inroads on ancient natural systems whose only laws were those of survival. First by trap and gun, and then with the plow, fire, and axe, man reversed his role in the natural order. With the capability to exploit and manipulate environments to his own advantage, man no longer sought to adapt to them. And maybe the way we talk about environments now, and especially in the sciences and in studies, doesn't get as explicit in this narrative, but this narrative and this way of thinking still implicitly underlies the way that we think about it and understand places. I realize I'm a little over my time, so I'll try to go through this a little faster. The other theme that I saw pop up a lot that is linked to this is the idea of a transitory space. And a lot of Indigenous places are described as being transitory spaces. So I just have a collection of quotes here, like there's little evidence to verify that Beaver Hills had Native people, or probably a home for transitory Native people. So every statement in these sentences is hedged by like probably, but little evidence, transitory, they weren't really there. Short-term use by people repairing tools as they waited for game to appear. So in every little bit of these sentences, agency is being taken out of the people they're describing. Again, any account of Native inhabitants has to relate to their use as a transitory space, sporadically use the area. And as I've been talking about contradiction a lot, some of these sentences contradict themselves like in the same sentence. So they say short-term use by people repairing stone tools as they waited for game to appear. Now this is the rest of the paragraph. This is the same paragraph. Then they go on to say several campsites reveal a large number and variety of tools, signs of more intensive long-term use, and a great range of domestic tasks. Tools include scrapers for preparing animal hides, pottery and hearths for cooking, small flakes of exotic stones brought to the site and shaped into tools, and large local quartzite cobbles made into heavy cutting and chopping tools. And that really does not sound transitory. That sounds quite developed and lived in and like very active. And so part of what I want to end with is my argument that the way that we describe and study ecosystems creates narratives about Indigenous governance, whether it's historical or present. And this is to enlarge in this outside of the case study, this is a description of prairie ecosystems in general. And it's a way that they are often described where, again, as I highlighted here, we acknowledge that periodic lightning fires ignited the prairie vegetation, that this is a really important part of the natural landscape. And then when natural fires didn't occur, Aboriginal people set fires. So acknowledging that, yes, there were Indigenous people setting fires, but only when natural fires didn't occur, maybe Indigenous people set fires. And that's a really downplaying the agency and intelligence of those practices. And I want to also note that it's actually, I would argue, more of the opposite, where actually one of the main reasons for maintaining areas with controlled burning is to prevent large lightning fires. So the way that they talk about these things is like when lightning fires didn't occur, then maybe people would use fire to maintain the area. But it actually works the opposite way, where people were setting fires to prevent large lightning fires. So if people weren't maintaining the areas with controlled burns, then periodic lightning fires would create large wildfires, which is the situation that we actually see in the environment today. This is another quote from my Cookham. I won't run through the whole quote, but the end of this really sticks with me because she talks about how research and knowledge work is also healing, and it's about understanding, this motivation to understand what happened, why we're here, and looking for answers. And that this also, I'll read this part, this also made it possible to feel joy and a sense of accomplishment and creativity in the course of my work. this is what was stolen from us, the ability to be creative and to experience a sense of accomplishment in our own activity. And so not only does this undermining of Indigenous agency, whether it's in the past or the present or the future, impact resources, knowledge, and governance, but it impacts us individually. I think doing this research was a healing process for me, where I've come to understand our role in the environment, and I have more of a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment in our history and in the work that I do today to better understand my purpose and role in my work. Oh, the other part of this is that often there's a distinction made between Indigenous knowledge and science, as I brought up before, and that there is almost like an inherent struggle to be an Indigenous person working in science. But I actually don't find a lot of struggle in studying science and studying the environment. I don't feel like a cultural struggle to do math or to do science. The things that I felt conflicted and struggled with is these narratives, to be in an onslaught of these narratives in that study every day, to be reading and hearing this in your classes and in your work and in your research, to be hearing these narratives of where Indigenous people are undermined in every sentence and every story. And so this master's research has helped to set the ground for me to try to do work, less theoretical, more material work in the sciences, in wildfire management, and to try to use that work to do it in a way that doesn't recreate these narratives. How can I do work that is based on a different narrative and that forwards different narratives? I won't return to that. And then my last slide here, my last note, I guess, to return to the idea of natural law is that I think this idea doesn't only impact Indigenous rights and Indigenous governance, it also impacts the way that all of us understand our relationship to the environment. Because if you think of people and the land or the environment as being separate, then you can also sort of absolve yourself of responsibility, where as long as we nature can recover itself. So whatever damage we do, as long as we leave it alone afterwards, it'll recover itself, because wilderness exists as this thing that manages itself, because it was good before us and it'll be good after us. But if you understand that that wilderness was actually managed by people, that those rich landscapes described by the explorers were places that were being managed by people, then you don't get to just walk away and say it'll be better off without us. It actually implies a responsibility for all people, that the land doesn't just restore itself if you walk away. And yes, that's all. That's my ending. So we need to all understand our responsibility in the environment, and not that we can just walk away. And this applies to non-Indigenous scientists as well. So to understand on a narrative level that just by either engaging with Indigenous research or not engaging with Indigenous research, that you could just do your research and not impact these narratives. But you have to actually understand that the default narratives that you create when you go by the way that it's been done so far, that creates harm. So you can't escape from doing harm. You can either disengage and let it be as it is and continue what's been done, or you can choose to try to engage and try to do things differently. And that's the end.
Thank you so much, Keara. This presentation was really fantastic, and you're receiving a lot of gratitude in the chat, a lot of thank yous, and I don't know if you could hear, but there was applause out there. So I have really enjoyed listening to your presentation. So thank you for not only sharing this with us, like your research, but also experiences that are so close to your heart and so close to you. So I really appreciate that. I know that's not easy. So thank you. Yeah, so now I would like to open it up to the audience to start like our Q&A. We do have some time. So if you have any questions, please put it inside of the Q&A section and then we'll get to it. Yeah, so I guess while I wait for the questions to come in, I'm gonna just start by asking you that you mentioned sort of towards the beginning of your talk how the narrative of like braiding or intertwining or combining Indigenous knowledge with like the scientific Western knowledge really ignores sort of like the power dynamics, the contexts and realities that these worldviews are experienced in. And so my question is, what can we, from the perspective of being like data scientists, ecologists, et cetera, ask ourselves at the onset of a project in order to approach the work in a way that recognizes this? And yeah.
It's a complicated question. Um, I'll give an example, I think, of a way that I'm thinking about this, and that's in fire research, of course. And I've done a lot of I've done a lot of reading on trying to see what people are saying in their research about this idea of human caused or lightning strike caused fire. And there's a lot of disagreement and just like outright debate, I guess, in the scientific journals about whether all of these lightning strikes to maintain places was historically lightning or human. And one of the issues that's been brought up in that is that like the way that you model these things changes what you would predict about that. So as I mentioned, that human fires have a different dynamic than plain wildfires. And so when they're looking for those models of what the fire should look like on the landscape, they could be modeling it around what a lightning fire looks like. And they could be looking for evidence of these like large fires. And it's going to be harder to find evidence of the controlled burns. It's going to be harder to find evidence of yeah, of lower intensity burns, and it looks differently. So I don't know if that really helps, but I think it's important to question like the assumptions in the way that we study, model, and measure things, and to look for different ways of measuring things. So controlled burns can be found by looking at fire scar rings or by looking at historical photography or by also incorporating ethnography and history. So I guess in a way interdisciplinary or just being willing to look at different sources and measurements. Even just to check your model, even just to check the way that you're measuring it against the way that someone else has done it to see what's being missed.
Thank you. Yeah, let's do our research, everyone. Thank you, Keara. We have a few questions in the chat. So one question from Ishel, the question is, what tools did you use, so like books, advice, videos, films, etc., to infuse an Indigenous ontology into your research and your work?
In my thesis, when I wrote it, I did it was supposed to be part of my method, but it ended up becoming a whole separate chapter on Keara ontology, where I used a lot of like these slides that I had at the beginning and read from people who are like my direct relatives, talked to my direct relatives as well, like I mentioned, but I did a lot of like considering these concepts and themes that had come up both in my cultural like involvement in life and living, and that I saw being talked about in things that have been written by interviews with elders and by Indigenous writers over time, especially Cree ones. And yeah, considering that to sort of build my ontology and try to work out all these concepts that were just like bouncing around in my head and heart.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Oliver, and that is, are there opportunities for using technologies such as ancient DNA and eDNA to reshape the dominant perspectives that is so destructive and inaccurate?
I don't know what those are. I'm sorry.
No worries. No,
Like my supervisors and people I work with DNA a lot, but I am sort of a collaborator with them, and I'm not an expert on DNA, so I'm not sure what those are. Sorry.
no worries. These are, we're throwing some really tough questions to solve the world, right? So no, thank you. Yeah, so another question that we have is, so you describe agency as a process of reconciliating scientific thinking and more holistic thinking. Do you have recommendations for scientists who are interested and really dedicated to this process?
In understanding agency. Sorry, could you read it again?
Yes, you described agency as a process of reconciling scientific thinking and holistic thinking. So the question is, do you have recommendations for scientists who are interested in this process?
Yeah, I was actually talking with my cooking last night about this because I was telling her about this talk and she was talking about her ideas. And what I came away from that talk was thinking about how the scientific, or I wouldn't call it scientific worldview, but like that possessive ontology, that possessive worldview where everything is owned or owner, and how that what has agency and what doesn't have agency. And that a lot of science does categorize, like, does take away agency from what you're studying. And that often in Indigenous worldviews, that everything is understood to have agency. So I actually don't think that that stops us from studying things. I don't think that that creates a contradiction for me to understand, like wanting to understand the environment, wanting to study fire. I think I could still see fire and still see the environment as being living beings who have agency and in the same way as humans have agency and still be able to want to study and understand them. I don't know if that helps, but it's something that I'm thinking a lot about. I guess I don't have direct advice.
Well, thank you. We are about at the hour, so I want to start wrapping up. And again, I want to thank you again. So for just this really excellent and fantastic talk and conversation. Yeah, thank you a lot, really. Thank you. If you should take a look at the chat, you're getting so much love in there. It's really nice.
Thank you so much. I saw
Yes.
someone looking for contact information and I realized I didn't put that on my slide, but my email for contact is klong1@ualberta.ca. So sorry, I tried to put it in chat, but I don't think I can.
No worries. We can also send it out like in an email to the participants after this meeting.
Hmm. Yeah, that'd be great. I sorry, I know we're ending, but I see braiding. So guys, one that I would
Yes.
alternatively, it's not perfect either, but has really been impactful on me was our knowledge is not primitive. And I think that takes a really interesting approach to trying to reintegrate stolen Indigenous knowledge back into Indigenous knowledge systems, just as a first option. There's a lot of really cool questions. I know we have to end.
I know, I know. Um, but anyway, thank you again so much. And thank you for everyone online for attending, for asking such excellent questions. And hopefully we can see you again next week. We have another DEIJ seminar series talk, and that'll be Eric Knows. So please tune in next week. And thank you again, Keara, for your time and for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much.